Hello everyone! Today we're going to find out what it was like to wake up 4,000 years ago on the banks of the Nile, when your biggest problem wasn't traffic or slow Wi-Fi, but whether the river's flood was going to destroy your crops or save your family from starvation. So, before we dive into this time machine, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's with us around the world. Now, imagine the desert heat. Maybe even turn on a fan to feel that warm breeze the Egyptians knew so well. Because today we're going to discover that the daily routine of an ancient Egyptian was far more sophisticated and stranger than you might think. When we think of ancient Egypt, the first things that come to mind are pyramids, mummies, and golden pharaohs. But what about the ordinary guy? What on earth did an Egyptian do from 6 a.m. until bedtime? Get ready to discover that they had dentists, went on strike, and wore makeup. Men and women alike. Yes, you heard that right. Forget your phone buzzing on the nightstand. In ancient Egypt, your alarm clock was none other than the god Ra himself, crossing the sky in a golden boat. Poetic? Maybe. Efficient? Absolutely. The Egyptians woke up with the sunrise, around 5:30 or 6 a.m. Not by choice, but because life revolved around the Nile and the sun. The two relentless bosses that decided when you worked, when you ate, and even when you made love. But let's start with the basics. Where did they sleep? Egyptian houses were built from mud bricks made with Nile silt mixed with straw, basically adobe in the ancient world. The walls were thick to keep the inside cool during the day, and warm through the cold desert nights. The wealthy slept on wooden beds with legs carved in the shape of animals. Lions, hippos, crocodiles, because apparently waking up to crocodile teeth was comforting. The mattress was made of interwoven ropes covered with fine linen. Pillows, curved wooden headrests to support the neck. Imagine sleeping with a block of wood under your head every night. The Egyptians were tough. The poor slept on straw mats on the floor, maybe with a straw pillow at best. But everyone, rich or poor, slept pretty much naked because of the heat. Nights in the desert could be cold, but inside brick houses, the heat accumulated during the day turned any bedroom into a sauna. When the first rays of sun came through the small windows, no glass, just wooden grills, the Egyptians didn't just wake up, they performed a small ritual. First a quick prayer to Ra, thanking him for another day of life. Then they checked to see if they still had all their toes. No joke. Scorpions, snakes, and other desert creatures loved to hide in clothes and shoes overnight. Waking up alive and intact was already a victory. The very first thing they did? Hygiene. Yes, they were obsessed with cleanliness, which makes sense when you live in a desert and your water source is also your highway, your public bathroom, and a crocodile graveyard. Egyptians took cleanliness seriously, very seriously. They believed dirt wasn't just disgusting, it was spiritually dangerous. Being dirty was almost like being cursed. They washed with Nile water in copper basins, if they were rich, or clay pots, if they were poor. The water was carried in jars by slaves, or fetched by the family themselves. No faucet, obviously. Egyptian soap was made from plant ash mixed with animal fat. It wasn't L'Oreal, but it did the job. The rich had perfumed versions with flower oils and spices. The poor had to settle for burnt fat scent. But here's the fascinating part. They brushed their teeth. Yes, 4,000 years before Oral-B, the Egyptians already knew dirty teeth meant trouble. They used chewed sticks until they frayed into a brush, along with a paste made of salt, mint, and other ingredients. Some medical papyri even describe recipes for toothpaste that included ashes, ground ostrich eggs, and pumice stone. Imagine the feeling. Here comes one of the most interesting parts. Makeup wasn't just for women. Men, women, children. Everyone wore kohl around their eyes. Everyone. Kohl wasn't just vanity. It was protection. The desert sun was merciless, and that black makeup worked like primitive sunglasses, reducing glare and protecting eyes from infection. It was made mostly of galena, lead sulfide, mixed with animal fat. They applied it with sticks of wood, bronze, or ivory, depending on your wealth. The result was that striking look we see in paintings and sculptures. Huge, black-rimmed eyes that gave an almost feline appearance. The rich even had green coal, made from malachite, to match their clothes or mood of the day, because apparently even makeup had to double as a social status statement. Egyptian breakfast was simple, but revealing of national character. The basics were always bread and beer. Yes, beer for breakfast wasn't just normal. It was expected. Barley bread was the main staple. It was baked in clay ovens in large quantities and distributed among the family. When fresh, it was soft and tasty. Once it cooled, which happened quickly in the dry climate, it hardened like a brick. Egyptians got used to dipping the bread in beer to soften it. Practical. Egyptian beer wasn't like today's beer. It was thicker, less alcoholic, and considered liquid food. Made from fermented barley, sometimes sweetened with honey or flavored with spices. Men, women, and even children drank beer because it was safer than water. Fermentation killed the bacteria the Nile might contain. If you were lucky, you had figs, dates, honey, onions, or garlic for breakfast. The rich could have duck or goose eggs, goat cheese, and even dried meat. Egyptian clothing was functional first, elegant second. Linen was basically the national uniform. Made from the flax plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta, it was cool, absorbed sweat, and dried quickly. For ordinary men, a simple linen loincloth covering from hips to knees. For women, long linen dresses covering from breasts to ankles. Simple, practical, and not very different from what's still worn in hot countries today. But the quality of the linen screamed your social status. Fine linen, nearly transparent, was for the wealthy, so sheer you could see through it. And that was exactly the point. Showing you could wear delicate, expensive fabric meant you didn't have to do hard labor under the sun. The poor wore coarse linen, sometimes dyed darker colors to hide dirt. The rich preferred white, a color that reflected heat and conveniently was the first to show any dirt. Wear white in the desert for a day, and you'll understand why only the wealthy could afford it. Shoes were for the rich and for special occasions. Most people walked barefoot all the time. Those who had shoes wore sandals of leather or woven straw. Pharaohs had sandals of solid gold, because apparently going barefoot was for commoners. Before leaving home, every Egyptian said a morning prayer. It wasn't optional. It was part of the routine, like brushing your teeth. The main prayer was to Ra, the sun god, thanking him for another day. But they also prayed to Taweret, the hippo goddess who protected the household, and to Bez, the dwarf god who scared away evil spirits. Homes had small altars with statuettes of household gods. They left simple offerings: a bit of bread, a drop of beer, a flower. Nothing elaborate but consistent. The wealthy had private chapels in their homes with personal priests. The poor made do with a small statue in a corner and whispered prayers. The Egyptians didn't have clocks, but they knew exactly what time it was by the sun's position. They divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, regardless of season. In summer, the hours were longer. In winter, shorter. Before leaving, they checked the sky. Clouds meant a sandstorm was coming. South winds brought extra heat. North winds promised a cooler day. Women planned household chores: weaving, cooking, caring for children, fetching water. Men got ready for work in the fields, workshops, or temples. Children, at least those who didn't have to work, prepared for another day of games in the shade. Everyone knew they had until noon to do heavy work. After that, the desert sun made physical labor dangerous. Egyptian life was simple math. Sun rises, you work. Sun gets too hot, you stop. Sun lowers, you work again. Sun sets, you relax. No office hours or 2 p.m. meetings in windowless rooms. If you think waking up at 6 a.m. is a sacrifice, imagine doing it without an alarm clock, without a hot shower, without coffee, and still having to thank the gods just for being alive. But wait until you discover how this seemingly simple society created a class system so complex, it would make a Modern HR consultant cry with envy. Egyptian society was not a democracy. Not even close. It was a literal social pyramid, with the pharaoh at the top as a living god, and 90% of the population at the bottom breaking their backs to keep the machine running. But here's what's disturbing. This rigid hierarchy, as unfair as it was, kept a civilization going for 3,000 years. The price? The freedom and dignity of 90% of the people. 3,000! Just for perspective, the Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years, and we already think that's impressive. Let's start at the bottom of the pyramid, because it's always more interesting to understand how the ones who did the heavy lifting lived. The peasants, called fellahin, made up 90% of Egypt's population. 90%! Imagine, out of every 10 people you met on a street in ancient Egypt, 9 were peasants. The last one might be a scribe, artisan, soldier, or priest. A peasant's life revolved around one single thing: the flooding of the Nile. Every year, between July and October, the river overflowed and flooded the banks, leaving behind a layer of black, fertile silt, the best soil in the world for farming. But here's the catch. If the flood was too low, famine. If it was too high, destruction. Peasants lived in a constant tug-of-war with nature, where the margin for error was zero. During flood season, when the fields were underwater, peasants were loaned out for public works. Pyramids, temples, palaces, all built by peasants who had nothing else to do anyway. It wasn't slavery. It was more like mandatory temp work, with food and beer included. A peasant's day started before sunrise. They woke up, said their basic prayers, ate hard bread soaked in beer, and headed to the fields with their primitive tools. Wooden hoes tipped with metal, stone sickles, and the famous shaduf, a wooden lever with a bucket on the end for lifting water from the river. The shaduf was brilliant in its simplicity. You dipped the bucket into the water, the lever eased the weight, and you could irrigate entire fields without breaking your back. 4,000 years later, farmers in rural Egypt still use this technology. Peasants planted mainly wheat and barley, the two pillars of the Egyptian economy. Wheat for bread, barley for beer. Simple as that. They also grew lentils, chickpeas, onions, garlic, cucumbers, and in good years, a few more sophisticated vegetables. A peasant's diet was monotonous but nutritious. Bread, beer, onion, garlic, lentils. The first meal plan in history. Bread, beer, onion, repeat. Nutritious? Yes. Varied? Not really. If lucky, they had a Nile fish. Meat? Only during religious festivals when temples distributed leftovers from sacrifices. But there was one advantage to being a peasant in Egypt. You couldn't be sold. Unlike other places in the ancient world, Egyptian peasants were tied to the land. But the land was tied to them too. It was servitude disguised as security. You knew you'd always have a place to live and something to eat. Always bread and onions, always in the same miserable condition, always without choice. Peasant women had the hardest life of all. They ran the household, cared for children, brewed beer, spun linen, cooked, fetched water, and still helped with the harvest. Basically, they did everything men did, plus all the domestic work. Some things never change, right? Peasant children started working early. By 7 or 8, they were already helping in the fields, tending animals, or hauling water. School? That was for the elite. A peasant's education was practical. Learn by doing or starve. But not everything was misery in peasant life. They had festivals, music, dances, stories. During the floods, when they couldn't work the land, they made crafts, repaired houses, visited relatives. It was like 4 months of forced vacation every year. Above the peasants came the artisans, Egypt's middle class. These were the specialists: carpenters, blacksmiths, potters, weavers, jewelers, painters, sculptors. People who mastered a specific skill and therefore had value. Carpenters were essential in a society that built everything out of imported wood. Furniture, boats, coffins, tools. Everything passed through a carpenter's hands. They worked mostly with local woods like sycamore and tamarisk, but fine work used cedar imported from Lebanon. and extremely expensive wood only the rich could afford. A carpenter woke up early, checked his tools, copper saws, bronze chisels, wooden squares, and headed to the workshop. They usually worked in groups, each one specialized in part of the process. One cut, another polished, another varnished. Potters had an interesting life. Nile clay was abundant and excellent, so demand was constant. They made everything: water jars, grain pots, plates, bowls, beer amphorae, religious figurines, even children's toys. The kiln was the heart of the operation. Brick ovens that reached extreme temperatures, fueled with straw and dried dung. The smell was terrible, but the result was pottery that lasted centuries. Weavers, mostly women, worked with linen from plant to finished fabric. They harvested flax, soaked it in the Nile to soften, separated fibers, spun, dyed, and wove. A fine linen dress could take months to complete. Dyes came from natural sources: indigo for blue, saffron for yellow. Imagine dyeing your clothes with enough spice for a whole banquet. And murex for purple, a dye so expensive only royalty could wear it. That's why purple became the color of power. Jewelers were the aristocracy of artisans. They worked with gold from Nubian mines, imported silver, precious stones from across the Mediterranean. They made necklaces, bracelets, rings, earrings, tiaras, and especially amulets, small protective pieces that every Egyptian wore. Jewelry work required years of training. It was an almost alchemical process, first melting the gold, then soldering pieces, engraving tiny designs, inlaying gems. Some pieces found in tombs are so sophisticated that modern jewelers struggle to replicate them. But the true kings of the middle class were the scribes. In a society where 99% of the people were illiterate, being able to read and write was a superpower. Scribes controlled all Egyptian bureaucracy. They collected taxes, recorded transactions, copied religious texts, drafted contracts, conducted censuses, planned works. Without scribes, nothing worked. Basically, they were the only ones who knew where each papyrus was, in an age without Ctrl plus F. To become a scribe, you had to study for years in a specialized school. You learned hieroglyphs, the sacred writing, hieratic, the administrative script, and later demotic, the popular script. You also studied math, geography, religion, literature. A scribe's tools were sacred: a wooden palette with inkwells, brushes made of reed papyrus, paper made from the papyrus plant that grew in the Nile Delta, black ink from charcoal for normal text, red from ochre for titles and highlights. A scribe woke up early, organized his materials, and went to work. In a temple, palace, government office, or simply in the shade of a square, where he served illiterate clients who needed letters or contracts. The life of a scribe had privileges. They were exempt from manual labor, received better rations, had larger houses, could educate their children. It was the only profession that guaranteed social mobility. A smart peasant could become a scribe and change class forever. At the top of the social pyramid were the priests and the administrative elite. These were the ones who really ruled. After the pharaoh, of course. Priests weren't just religious leaders. They were administrators, doctors, architects, mathematicians, astronomers. Egyptian temples were universities, hospitals, banks, and government offices all at once. A priest woke up earlier than everyone for the morning rituals. First, purification. Ritual bath, white linen robes, body hair removed, because hair was considered impure. Then, opening the god's sanctuary, changing the statue's clothes, offering food, reciting prayers. But the real work started after the rituals: managing temple lands, supervising construction, attending the faithful, settling disputes, offering medical consultations. Egyptian temples were like small independent cities with thousands of employees. Priests had access to sacred texts, the source of all scientific knowledge of the time. Medicine, astronomy, math, engineering, all stored in temple libraries. The administrative elite, viziers, governors, generals, lived even better. Huge houses with gardens, servants, chariots, fine linen clothes, jewelry, multiple wives, concubines. A vizier, the pharaoh's prime minister, woke up in imported linen sheets, bathed in perfumed oils, dressed in garments worth a peasant's yearly salary, and went to the palace in a litter carried by slaves. His duties included supervising tax collection across the country, organizing public works, administering justice, commanding the army, overseeing foreign trade, advising the pharaoh. Basically, running the whole country while the pharaoh worried about being a god. But even the elite had rules. No one, absolutely no one, could approach the pharaoh uninvited. Even viziers had to follow strict protocols. Prostrate, no direct eye contact, speak only when asked. And here's what's most impressive. This rigid hierarchy lasted for 3 millennia. Each class knew exactly its place, its functions, its limits. There was no democracy, and stability cost the freedom of nearly everyone. There was no equality, and order was maintained through forced resignation. The Egyptians believed this social order mirrored the cosmic order. Each person was born into a class by the will of the gods, and questioning that was questioning the universe itself. But even within this rigidity, there was room for social mobility. An exceptionally bright peasant could become a scribe. A talented scribe could become an administrator. A brilliant artisan could catch the eye of the elite. Rare cases, but possible. What none of these classes imagined was that they would wake up every morning in the middle of the harshest desert in the world and still create gardens, palaces, and works of art that would survive for millennia. Each trapped in their class, each without choice over their life, in a social machine that crushed 90% of the people for longer than any empire in history. But understanding who ruled and who obeyed is only half the story. The other half is discovering how everyone survived when the very climate seemed determined to kill them. Noon in the Egyptian desert is no joke. Temperatures can easily hit 113 degrees in the shade, when there is shade. The sun strikes with a force that seems to melt stone. And in the middle of all that, Egyptians still had to work, eat, live. But they discovered something our modern society forgot. When nature says stop, you stop. You don't negotiate, you don't work overtime, you don't find a way. You stop. From 11 a.m. on, when the sun became truly murderous, all physical activity halted. Peasants dropped their hoes in the fields. Artisans closed their workshops. Even slaves got a forced break. It wasn't kindness from their bosses. It was survival. Working under the noon sun was a death sentence. Heat stroke, dehydration, collapse. Egyptians learned it the hard way over generations and built an entire culture around this mandatory pause. The Egyptian midday rest lasted from 11 to 14 hours. 3 sacred hours, when the only permitted activity was not dying of heat. But where do you hide when you live in the middle of a desert? Egyptian houses were true heat defense fortresses. Thick mud brick walls that blocked outside heat. Low ceilings that kept cool air near the floor. Interior courtyards that created airflow. Small windows facing north, where the breeze was cooler. The wealthy had primitive but ingenious cooling systems. Porous jars full of water were hung on walls. As water evaporated through the clay, it cooled the room. It still works. Some rural Egyptians use this technique today. They also spread wet mats on bedroom floors. As the water evaporated, it created a cooling sensation. Not air conditioning, but in a well-designed house, the temperature difference between outside and inside could reach 27 degrees. The poor crowded into any shade they could find. Walls, trees, overturned boats, even the shadows of buildings. Entire groups of workers huddled under makeshift tents made of old cloth. But the heat break wasn't just for sleeping. It was the time for the main meal of the day. Egyptian lunch was strategic. Food to satisfy hunger, hydrate the body, and provide energy for the afternoon, without sitting like a rock in your stomach under the heat. The base was always bread and beer, the dynamic duo of Egyptian food. But at noon they added fresh ingredients that helped fight the heat. Raw onions were non-negotiable. Egyptians discovered that onions have antiseptic properties and help regulate body temperature. Workers ate onions the way we eat candy, constantly. Garlic was sacred too. Beyond flavor, it was medicine. They believed garlic protected against infection, gave energy, and drove away the evil eye. No wonder the pyramid builders received a daily garlic ration. Cucumbers were another lifesaver, water-rich, refreshing, easy to store. Egyptians developed growing techniques that produced cucumbers almost year-round. To drink, besides the obligatory beer, they had water with honey and vinegar, a kind of early sports drink that replaced salts lost through sweat. The wealthy had additional luxuries: imported fruits like pomegranates, grapes, fresh figs, Nile fish grilled on the spot, creamy goat cheese, even primitive ices, snow brought from Nubian mountains mixed with honey and fruit. But for everyone, rich or poor, the rule was the same: eat slowly, chew well, drink plenty. Digestion in the heat is tricky. The body diverts blood from the digestive organs to the skin to cool down. Eating too much or too fast could cause discomfort, vomiting, fainting. So Egyptian lunch was long. They talked, rested, napped between bites. No hurry. Time was set by the sun, not by a clock. During these 3 hours of forced pause, much of Egyptian social life happened. Neighbors visited, families gathered, children played in the shade, elders told stories, women traded gossip and recipes. It was the hour for small transactions: trading eggs for fish, swapping a sandal repair for a jar of beer, lending tools, discussing marriages. Scribes used the time to work on tasks that didn't require travel: copying religious manuscripts, drafting contracts, updating records. Intellectual work continued even when physical work stopped. Priests performed midday prayers, specific rites asking for protection against excessive heat. Offerings to Sekhmet, the lioness goddess associated with both heat and healing. But the most important activity of these 3 hours was maintenance. Anything that could be fixed, cleaned, or organized in the shade was done during the rest period. Women mended clothes, wove baskets, prepared threads for weaving. Men sharpened tools, repaired sandals, prepped materials for the afternoon. Children helped by sorting seeds, cleaning utensils, feeding small animals. Animals got their forced break too. Oxen, donkeys, and camels were brought into the shade and given extra water. Leaving an animal under the noon sun was wasteful, and Egyptians could not afford waste. Dogs and cats, the two most common pets, spent the whole day sleeping in the shade. Cats, by the way, were revered not only for killing rats, but for the natural wisdom of doing nothing in the heat. As the sun began to decline, around 2 p.m., Egyptian life slowly came back to activity, but it wasn't an abrupt return. Egyptians developed a gradual reactivation routine. First, they checked the temperature by touching walls exposed to the sun. If they were still scorching, they waited a bit longer. If merely hot, it was safe to begin. They drank extra water before leaving the shade. They wet cloths and put them on their heads as added protection. They mentally planned the afternoon tasks to maximize efficiency and minimize exposure. Peasants returned to the fields with a different strategy. Tasks requiring more strength, like plowing or digging, were saved for late afternoon. Mid-afternoon was for lighter work: picking fruit, watering plants, cleaning irrigation channels. Artisans reopened workshops but kept all openings draped with wet cloths to filter hot air. They worked in short shifts, alternating between work and rest. Scribes resumed administrative duties that required moving around: visits to other offices, tax collection, inspection of works, always carrying extra water and chasing shadows. The interesting thing is that this mandatory pause created a culture of planning that few ancient peoples had. Egyptians naturally divided each day in two: a productive morning and a productive afternoon, with a survival bridge in the middle. That forced them to be extremely efficient in the usable hours. There was no time for stalling. When the sun was low, you worked hard. When it got too high, you stopped. As simple as that. This natural discipline showed up in every aspect of Egyptian civilization. They planned projects that would last decades because they knew exactly how many hours per day, how many days per month, how many months per year they could work. The pyramids were not built by slaves working around the clock. They were built by workers who respected the limits of their bodies and of nature, and who, when they did work, worked with total focus. The lesson Egyptians learned, and that our modern society insists on ignoring, is that productivity has nothing to do with how many hours you work. It's about working at the right hours, in the right way, with body and mind at peak capacity. Working under the noon heat isn't dedication. It's foolishness. Egyptians knew that 4,000 years ago. We're still learning. 3 hours of shade, talk, and rest. And right after came the real marathon. The afternoon when everything had to happen at once. 2 o'clock in the afternoon in ancient Egypt was like the school bell. Everyone knew it was time to get back to work. But it wasn't a desperate rush. It was strategic, calculated, almost choreographed. The Egyptians had developed a kind of natural radar to detect when the sun stopped being homicidal and went back to being merely unbearable. A crucial difference for anyone living in the desert. The Egyptian afternoon, from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., was when civilization really functioned. Morning was preparation, midday was survival, but afternoon was peak productivity. First came the testers, usually children or elders who didn't have much to lose. They put their hands on the wall, stepped on the ground, felt the air. If they didn't melt in 2 minutes, it was safe for everyone else. Peasants returned to the fields with a military-style strategy. No heavy work yet. That was saved for late afternoon. They started with lighter tasks, watering plants, cleaning irrigation channels, picking fruit that ripened in the shade. The Egyptian irrigation system worked like a Swiss clock, except it ran on muscle and sweat. Main canals carried water from the Nile into secondary channels, which flowed into smaller ones, reaching the farthest plants. All dug by hand, all maintained with effort. In the afternoon, groups of peasants rotated duties. Some cleared channels clogged with silt, good for crops, bad for water flow. Others repaired wooden gates that controlled the current. It was constant work, because the Nile punished neglect. Women managed operations that would make a modern executive break into a sweat. They coordinated beer production, a process that lasted days and couldn't go wrong because spoiled beer meant a hungry family. They supervised weaving, from harvesting flax to the finished fabric. They managed food stores, calculating exactly how much to consume so nothing ran out before the next harvest. Brewing beer was pure science. They took half-baked barley loaves, crumbled them into water, let them ferment for precise days. No more, no less. The right point was detected by smell, by color, even by the sound of fermentation. An experienced brewer could predict success just by looking at the foam. Artisans reopened workshops with protocols worthy of an operating room. First, ventilation, wet cloths over all openings to filter hot air. Second, hydration, jars of water placed strategically. Third, schedule, 30-minute work shifts, 10 minutes of rest. Carpenters took advantage of wood being at the perfect temperature, neither dried out by morning sun nor too damp from the night. It was the perfect moment for precision work. Joints, carvings, final polishing. Blacksmiths had the hardest afternoons. They needed fire to work metal, but fire plus desert heat was a deadly combination, so they built ingenious furnaces with chimneys that vented heat outside the shop. Even so, they worked almost naked and in very short shifts. Potters had the advantage. Moist clay in dry air was perfect for shaping. Pieces dried at the ideal speed without cracking. Afternoon was when they produced their most delicate works. Jars with complex designs, religious figurines, toys for children. Egyptian children had a childhood that would make modern parents panic. They played freely in the streets, swam in the Nile, crocodiles included, climbed trees, ran through the desert. Of course, many didn't reach adulthood, but those who did were tough as leather. Their toys were brilliant in their simplicity. Wooden dolls with movable limbs, the first action figures in history. leather balls stuffed with straw, clay spinning tops, pebble games that taught math without kids realizing it. Boys from age 7 began following their fathers to work, not as laborers, but as apprentices. They observed, asked questions, tested small tools. It was hands-on technical education. Girls learned from their mothers the mysteries of the household, far more complex than many modern college degrees. Calculating rations, spotting spoiled food, diagnosing childhood illnesses, mediating neighborhood conflicts. No Google to consult. The afternoon scribes were the elite in action. They left offices for fieldwork, literally, inspecting construction, collecting taxes, resolving disputes, mediating business. Carrying the scribe's kit through the city was almost a parade of status. Polished wooden palette, neatly arranged brushes, rolled papyri, fresh ink. People bowed, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. A scribe represented knowledge, justice, connection to power. Egyptian taxes were collected mainly in goods: grain, livestock, crafts. The scribe arrived at the property, evaluated production, calculated the portion owed to the pharaoh. Everything recorded, everything noted. Tax evasion was hard when your inspector knew exactly how many stalks of wheat you had. The afternoon priests were spiritual CEOs. They managed vast assets: lands, herds, workshops, even fleets of boats. Egyptian temples were economic complexes that employed thousands of people. But they didn't neglect the religious side. They performed mid-afternoon prayers when the sun began to decline, and Ra started his journey to the underworld. Fresh food offerings for the statues of gods, altar cleaning, preparation for nightly rituals. Priest-doctors treated lines of patients who had been waiting since morning. Egyptian medicine was a fascinating mix of science and superstition. They could perform surgeries, treat fractures, even cataracts. But they also prescribed amulets, magic potions, and specific prayers. Medical papyri of the time described procedures that would impress modern doctors: surgery to remove tumors, techniques to realign broken bones, recipes for anesthetics made from opium and herbs. It was cutting-edge medicine for its era, with a touch of magic for good measure. Afternoon merchants turned squares and streets into open-air markets: canvas tents, wooden stalls, rugs on the ground. Everything came from the countryside: grain from the south, fish from the north, crafts from every region. Negotiations were theater-worthy spectacles. Haggling was a refined art, not disrespectful, but tradition. The buyer offered half the asking price. The seller pretended to be outraged, both knowing they'd meet in the middle. Currency as we know it didn't exist. Everything was barter: my fish for your bread, my pottery for your linen. But there were value standards. 1 ox equaled 100 loaves of bread. A sandal equaled 5 jars of beer. A complex system, but it worked. Afternoon soldiers patrolled borders and monitored international trade. Egypt was the mandatory route for merchants traveling between Africa and the Mediterranean, and everyone paid taxes. Border checkpoints were like modern customs offices, only with soldiers carrying spears and bows. They inspected goods, collected duties, investigated suspects. Smuggling existed, of course, but it was a high-risk job. The Egyptian army was professional. Career soldiers, not peasants drafted at random. They trained constantly: archery, spears, swords, hand-to-hand combat. Military discipline was strict. Rigid hierarchy, harsh punishments, merit-based rewards. As the sun began to decline around 4:30 p.m., all activities intensified. It was the last hour of strong light, the last chance to finish urgent projects. Peasants finally did the heavy work postponed since morning: plowing new land, digging ditches, carrying stones for construction. Muscles warmed up, sun less aggressive, breeze starting to appear. Women sped up dinner prep: grinding grain, baking bread, cooking stews. Fire lit, pots in place, family gathered around the kitchen. Children were called home, animals brought in, tools stored away. The Egyptian workday was ending, but social life was just beginning. If you think working only 4 productive hours a day was easy, Remember, they built pyramids, developed advanced medicine, created art that survived millennia, all while respecting the limits of the human body and of nature. The Egyptian lesson is clear. Productivity isn't about working more hours. It's about working at the right hours, with maximum energy, without wasting time fighting forces you can't beat. But wait until you discover how they turned the end of the day into a celebration of life. Because after surviving another day in the desert, every Egyptian sunset was a victory. 6 o'clock in the evening in ancient Egypt was like the final whistle of a match. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief for having made it alive that far. And then the most interesting part of the day began. Sunset in the desert is not like anywhere else. It's a half-hour spectacle of colors that turns the entire sky into a painting. Egyptians stopped everything to watch. Not out of romance, but because that moment meant the worst was over. It was literally a national ritual. Families climbed to the rooftops of their houses. Peasants gathered in the fields. City workers met in the squares, all facing west, watching Ra complete another journey across the sky. But while enjoying the natural light show, they were already preparing for the second half of the day, the social part. The first item on the agenda was bathing. After an entire day sweating in the desert heat, cleanliness wasn't luxury. It was medical necessity. The wealthy had private bathrooms with running water, ingenious canal systems that brought Nile water straight into the house, stone bathtubs, perfumed oils, servants to assist, almost like a private spa. The poor bathed in the Nile itself, in designated areas. Men on one side, women on the other, children running between the two groups. Soap made of ash and animal fat, but fresh water in abundance. And before you ask, yes, they knew about crocodiles. They had lookouts posted to give warning when one appeared, basically the least reassuring lifeguard in history. After bathing, it was time for the most important meal of the day: dinner. Egyptian evening kitchens were pure coordination. Women commanded operations that involved fire, smoke, multiple pots, children running, and neighbors giving opinions. Organized chaos, with the detail that there was always one neighbor who could cook better than you. The menu depended on social class but followed similar patterns. The base was always the same: fresh bread, cool beer. Yes, they had techniques to chill beer using porous jars and evaporation. Peasants added whatever they had: onions, garlic, lentils, sometimes river fish. Dessert was conversation with onion breath, but nobody cared because everyone was in the same boat. Artisans and scribes could add goat cheese, eggs, fresh fruit, honey. Meat appeared on special occasions: weddings, religious festivals, important visits. The elite dined like kings, literally. Beef, duck, goose, wines imported from the Mediterranean, exotic fruits from distant regions, desserts made with honey, nuts, and spices. But regardless of class, Egyptian dinner was a social event. No one ate alone if they could avoid it. It was a time for conversation, planning, gossip. The original social network. Conversations revolved around universal themes: work, family, neighbors, worries about the next Nile flood. Politics was for the men, household matters for the women, but everyone had an opinion on everything. Small children ate alongside adults, absorbing conversations that were their only education about the world. This was how they learned history, traditions, family values. After dinner came entertainment. And here Egyptians were creative. Music was essential. Everyone sang. Most knew how to play at least a simple instrument. A domestic orchestra rivaling any modern band, just with more flutes and fewer guitar egos. Songs told stories. Adventures of gods, legends of the Nile, feats of ancient pharaohs. Entertainment and education at the same time. A primitive Netflix, but with active audience participation. Dance followed the music. Men, women, children all danced. These weren't elaborate choreographies, just natural movements that expressed the joy of surviving another day. Games were a national passion. The most popular was senet, a kind of Egyptian backgammon everyone knew how to play. wooden boards with decorated squares, pieces of bone or ivory, dice made from animal bones. Senet wasn't just fun. Egyptians believed the game simulated the soul's journey through the afterlife. Winning meant good luck after death. Betting on a match was literally betting on your spiritual destiny. Losing must have been depressing on another level. Other games included an early form of checkers, pebble games that taught math, and guessing competitions that tested knowledge of local traditions. Children had their own amusements: wooden dolls with real hair, human strands woven into elaborate braids, wheeled toys pulled by strings, balls for group games that mixed soccer with basketball. The elderly gathered to tell stories, a living repository of cultural memory. Tales of devastating floods, legendary pharaohs, epic battles, dramatic romances. An oral library that preserved history across generations. Some nights were special, when merchants from distant regions arrived, bringing news of the outside world. It was their newspaper. Who was at war with whom? Which cities were thriving? What inventions had appeared? Merchants were temporary celebrities, surrounded by curious people, bombarded with questions, invited to dinners in exchange for stories. The influencers of antiquity. And the best part, no online course at the end. Religious festivals turned ordinary nights into carnivals. Torchlight processions, loud music, free food distributed by temples, dances that lasted until dawn. The festival of Opet was the greatest of all, a celebration that lasted weeks, with sacred boats sailing down the Nile, crowds following along the banks, beer flowing freely for everyone. A national holiday that stopped the entire country. During these festivals, social rules loosened. Peasants mingled with nobles, women spoke more freely, children stayed up late, a social release valve that prevented tensions from building up. Romance also had its place. Young couples took advantage of the cool evenings to talk on rooftops, walk along the riverbanks, exchange symbolic gifts, flowers, small jewels, poems written on papyrus. Egyptian courtship was supervised but not repressive. Families met. Young people talked in the presence of parents, but there was room for genuine affection before marriage. Love letters from the time reveal romantic feelings within the norms of the era. My heart beats like a drum when I see your eyes. Poetry that worked even in a society where marriage was more contract than romance. As night went on, activities became more intimate. Families withdrew indoors. Neighbors said goodnight. Children were put to bed. But adults still had a few hours of private conversation. Husbands and wives planned the next day, discussed worries, shared dreams. Real intimacy, away from community eyes. Couples made plans for the future. Expanding the house, buying more animals, educating children better. Practical talks, but ones that strengthened family bonds. Egyptians also used these hours for extra personal care, beauty treatments with oils and herbs, massages to relax tired muscles, basic medical care, bandages, ointments, home remedies. Women took the time for household maintenance, mending clothes that required good light, organizing utensils, preparing ahead for the next day. By around 9 p.m., when the stars dominated the sky, most families prepared to sleep. Not for lack of things to do, but because the next day would start early and demand full energy. Bedtime was almost ritual. Final check of doors and windows, prayers of thanks for surviving another day, simple offerings to household gods. The last conversations were whispered, private concerns, secret plans, expressions of affection that couldn't be public during the day. But even after everyone went to bed, the city didn't sleep completely. Night guards patrolled the streets, bakers started work to have fresh bread for morning, fishermen set out for night catches. Ancient Egypt never fully stopped. It was a social machine running 24 hours, with different groups taking turns in natural shifts. The lesson from Egyptian entertainment is fascinating. They understood that fun wasn't a waste of time. It was an investment in mental health. After hard days in the desert, nightly joy was the fuel to face the next day. Music, games, stories, romance. None of this was luxury for the rich. It was human necessity, something every society must satisfy if it wants to survive long term. And if laughter and music gave life its lightness, religion gave it meaning. In Egypt, faith wasn't a burden. It was daily practice, as essential as bread and water. Religion in ancient Egypt wasn't a Sunday thing. It was an everyday, every hour, every moment thing, but so natural that it hardly felt like religion. Imagine waking up and, before brushing your teeth, giving a quick hey to the sun god. Before leaving home, pouring a drop of beer for the goddess who protects your family. Before bed, giving thanks for surviving another day in the desert. It wasn't religious neurosis. It was spiritual life insurance. Egyptians had gods for everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. God of the sun, the moon, the wind, the water, the onion, sex, beer, and hangovers. If it existed, there was a god in charge. Ra was the boss. The sun god who crossed the sky each day in a golden boat. But he had help. Isis for family matters, Ta for work and craft, Taweret to protect pregnant women, Bes to chase away nightmares. It was like having a divine contact list. Trouble at work? Call Ptah. Fight at home? Isis handles it. Scorpion nightmare? Bes has you covered. A typical Egyptian home had a sacred corner. Not an elaborate altar, just a shelf with small figurines of household gods, 10 to 15 inches tall, made of clay or wood, painted in bright colors. In the morning, the family left simple offerings: a bit of bread, a drop of beer, a flower picked from the yard. Nothing dramatic, nothing expensive. It was casual conversation with deities who understood the hardships of desert life. Ra, another hot day, huh? Help me not keel over. Isis, the kids are impossible today, lend a hand. Bes, if any scorpions are prowling, shoo them away. Egyptian prayers were practical, not forgive my sins or save my soul. More like, help me not mess up today, and thanks for the food on the table. Amulets were a national obsession. Everyone wore them, rich, poor, children, adults. Little protective objects hung around the neck, sewn into clothing, hidden in shoes. The Eye of Horus was the most popular, a portable bless you for protection. The scarab was another favorite, symbolizing renewal and good luck. There were amulets for every situation: travel, childbirth, work, sleep, digestion. Was it superstition or faith? Who cares? It worked like a divine placebo that gave people confidence to face a world full of snakes, scorpions, disease, and killer heat. Egyptian temples weren't churches in our sense. They were centers of everything, the place to solve problems from health to legal disputes. Ordinary people didn't enter the inner sanctuary, but they used the services the temple provided. Priest-physicians treated the sick. Priest-scribes handled legal matters. Priest-mathematicians calculated taxes and planned public works. Priest-farmers managed temple lands. During festivals, temples became entertainment hubs. Processions with music, dancing, free food, beer for all. A religious carnival that brought the whole community together. The festival of Opet lasted for weeks. Sacred boats sailed the Nile carrying statues of the gods. Crowds followed along the banks, singing and dancing. A nationwide holiday that stopped the entire country. And everyone got a little tipsy on sacred beer. But Egyptian religion had a practical side too. They believed the gods helped those who helped themselves. No point asking for a good harvest if you didn't plant properly. No point asking for health if you didn't take care of yourself. It was common sense theology. The gods give strength, but you have to use it. Death was an obsession, but not a morbid one. It was long-term planning. Egyptians saw earthly life as preparation for eternity. So everything they did carried that perspective. That didn't mean they lived depressed, thinking about death. On the contrary, because the afterlife depended on what you did in life, they tried to live well, treat people right, and leave a positive legacy. Mummification wasn't just for pharaohs. Ordinary people mummified relatives too. Simpler, cheaper versions, but with the same goal: preserve the body for the spiritual journey. Families saved for a lifetime to afford a decent mummification. It was an investment in the beyond, a funeral policy to make sure the dead arrived whole in the realm of the gods. Funerary rites lasted 70 days, the time needed to fully dehydrate the body. During that period, the family visited the deceased, spoke to them, updated them on what was happening in town. It was active mourning, not passive. After burial, they kept visiting the tomb, bringing food, drink, and flowers. They believed the dead still had basic needs: hunger, thirst, loneliness. The relationship continued beyond life. It may sound strange, but it created a sense of family continuity that lasted generations. Dead grandparents were still consulted on important decisions. A living family tree, literally. Egyptian ethics were straightforward. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie. Don't be cruel to animals. Honor your parents. Help those in need. Nothing very different from any modern religion, but applied to daily life with impressive practicality. They believed in a final judgment. Your heart would be weighed on a scale against the feather of truth. If it was lighter than the feather, eternal life. If heavier, it would be devoured by a monster. It was a system of cosmic justice that worked better than many human laws. If you believed your actions in life determined your eternal fate, you thought twice before doing something stupid. But they weren't fanatics. Egyptian religion had a flexibility that allowed different interpretations, different practices, different levels of involvement. Peasants practiced a simple religion: basic prayers, modest offerings, participation in festivals. Priests devoted themselves to complex theological studies, elaborate rituals, deep meditations. There was no inquisition, no persecution for heresy. As long as you respected the main gods and didn't disrupt social order, you could believe what you wanted. That religious tolerance contributed to Egypt's stability. Different regions had favorite local gods, but everyone recognized the national pantheon. It was a kind of spiritual federalism that worked. Religion also shaped art. Painting, sculpture, architecture, everything carried religious meaning. Not art for art's sake, but art with a purpose: to teach, to inspire, to connect humans with divinity. The pyramids are the perfect example. They weren't just grand tombs, they were spiritual machines designed to ease the dead pharaoh's journey to the realm of the gods. Every angle, corridor, and chamber had a specific religious function. But even religious art had genuine beauty. Egyptians believed the gods appreciated beautiful things, so they lavished care on details. It was an aesthetic offering, pleasing divine eyes with the best they could create. Music in the temples was spectacular. Huge choirs, sophisticated instruments, compositions that lasted for hours. Sacred entertainment that lifted the spirit and taught religious traditions. Women played an important role in Egyptian religion. They could be priestesses, take part in rituals, even lead temples. Cleopatra was both pharaoh and high priestess, political and religious power in one person. That didn't make it an egalitarian society. Far from it. But religion provided space for female leadership that other ancient cultures didn't allow. Children learned religion naturally by watching their parents, joining festivals, listening to stories about the gods. There was no formal catechism. It was religious education through everyday life. Little by little, they understood that the gods were partners in the journey, not tyrant lords demanding total submission, but allies helping humans navigate life's hardships. Egyptian religion taught something our society is still trying to learn. Spirituality can be a natural part of life without taking it over. It can give meaning and comfort without turning into obsession or fanaticism. It was faith with both feet on the ground, connected to the practical realities of desert life, yet open to mysteries beyond human experience. If you think a balanced spiritual life is impressive, get ready to uncover the strangest, most surprising sides of Egyptian civilization, things that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. Get ready, because this is where Egyptian history gets so strange it sounds fake. But everything you're about to hear is documented in papyri, tomb paintings, and archaeological finds. Starting with the basics, makeup. We already said men wore kohl around the eyes, but it went far beyond that. Egyptians invented lipstick, colorful eyeshadow, blush, even glitter. Yes, glitter. They ground shiny minerals, mica, pyrite, and mixed them with oils to create shimmering makeup. Parties at the pharaoh's palace literally sparkled. Everyone covered in natural glitter. And it wasn't just vanity. They used green makeup made from malachite because they believed it protected against eye infections. Coincidence or not, malachite has antibacterial properties. They stumbled into medicinal cosmetology. Speaking of medicine, Egyptians performed surgeries that would make any modern hospital proud. They operated on cataracts, removing the eye's lens with bronze instruments. They did trepanation, drilling into the skull to relieve pressure. They amputated limbs and made functional prosthetics. One mummy was found with a prosthetic toe made of wood and leather, jointed so the person could walk normally. Biomedical engineering from 4,000 years ago. Egyptian dentists were absolute pioneers. They did fillings with tree resins, extracted teeth with metal forceps, even rudimentary implants using teeth made from other materials. Mummies have been found with dental work that lasted for decades, but here's where it gets bizarre. They also did orthodontics, gold wires tied to teeth to correct alignment. Pharaoh-era braces. Imagine explaining that to your friends. Egyptian contraception was creative. Women used suppositories made with honey, sodium carbonate, and crocodile dung. Don't ask how they discovered it worked. Some historical experiments are better left unimagined. They also had pregnancy tests. Women urinated on barley and wheat seeds. If they sprouted, she was pregnant. If only barley sprouted, it would be a boy. If only wheat, a girl. Sounds crazy, but modern studies confirmed it works about 70% of the time. Egyptian chemistry was out of this world. They knew how to make colored glass, dyes that didn't fade after millennia, perfumes that lasted for years, even primitive explosives used in mining. Perfume was a national obsession. Rich and poor used fragrances, some with rare imported oils, others with local flower and herb essences. There were professional perfumers who created custom scents for each client. Cleopatra had a personal perfume so distinctive that people recognized her presence before seeing her. An olfactory signature, personal branding by aromatherapy. Egyptian cooling worked by evaporation. Porous clay jars filled with water, hung where air currents flowed, created cool microclimates indoors. More elaborate systems used indoor fountains and aquatic plants to cool entire rooms. The wealthy had cooled chambers where the temperature could be about 18 degrees Celsius lower than outside. Air conditioning powered by basic physics and Nile water. Transportation was revolutionary. Egyptian ships sailed the entire Mediterranean, trading with Greece, Anatolia, even the Iberian Peninsula. They had detailed maps, primitive compasses, and enough astronomical knowledge for night navigation. But most impressive of all, they transported granite obelisks weighing hundreds of tons from southern Egypt to the north, using special boats and engineering techniques still studied today. The construction of the pyramids remains a partial mystery, but we know they used ramps, levers, and, above all, military-grade organization. They weren't exhausted slaves. They were specialized, well-fed workers on organized shifts. Receipts show they received daily rations of bread, beer, garlic, and onion. They even went on strike when conditions worsened. The first recorded labor strike in history happened at a royal tomb worksite. Egyptian paperwork was obsessive. They documented everything: contracts, inventories, personal letters, medical recipes, even jokes. We have papyri with Egyptian humor, puns on the names of gods, parodies of sacred texts, even primitive cartoons. One papyrus contains a comedic dialogue between a lazy scribe and his irate boss. An office sitcom from 4,000 years ago, proof that some problems are eternal. Egyptian education was rigorous. Children from wealthy families started school at 5. Hieroglyphs, math, literature, music. They used wooden tablets coated with wax. writing and erasing lessons over and over. Teachers used palm rods for correction. Smacks on the hands were the standard punishment for writing mistakes. "A boy's ear is on his back" was an educational proverb. They learn better when consequences are felt. Egyptian sports included events that look modern: wrestling, boxing, fencing, archery, swimming, rowing. They had organized competitions, standardized rules, even referees. Women practiced acrobatic gymnastics. Paintings show sequences of movements that resemble modern artistic gymnastics. They also played a kind of handball and took part in dance competitions. Egyptian music used complex scales that influenced the development of later music. They had orchestras of more than 100 musicians, with wind, string, and percussion instruments creating elaborate symphonies. Egyptian composers were celebrities. Their music was copied, adapted, and played across the empire. It was a cultural industry that generated income and prestige comparable to any modern hit. The Egyptian postal system worked better than many services today. Horseback messengers carried letters across the country with relay stations, standardized routes, even a primitive seal system using clay stamps. Letters could travel from southern to northern Egypt in under 2 weeks. Astonishing speed for a world without engines. Egyptian agriculture was scientific. They rotated crops, used natural fertilizers, developed plant varieties adapted to the local climate. They kept detailed agricultural calendars based on Nile floods. They kept bees in artificial hives, practicing large-scale beekeeping. Egyptian honey was exported across the Mediterranean. The sugar of antiquity, a luxury product coveted by every neighboring civilization. Egyptian pets went beyond dogs and cats. They had trained monkeys, domesticated gazelles, even crocodiles as household animals. Obviously only for the very rich and very brave. Animal mummies show they took pets into the afterlife. Dogs, cats, birds, even fish have been found mummified alongside their owners. Unconditional love crossing spiritual dimensions. Egyptian astronomy was precise enough to predict eclipses, calculate the solar year with minimal error, and create calendars that still influence our system. They understood Earth's shape centuries before later thinkers. Priest astronomers made detailed sky maps, identified constellations, and used the motion of heavenly bodies for agriculture and navigation. Applied science that worked in practice. Egyptian cosmetics weren't just about beauty. They were advanced chemistry, anti-aging creams with ingredients still used today. Aloe vera, castor oil, beeswax, even a primitive retinoid extracted from animal liver. 3,000-year-old. Mummies show impressively preserved skin, the result of steady cosmetic care in life and conservation techniques that preserved tissues for millennia. Egyptian hydraulic engineering controlled Nile floods with surgical precision. A system of dams, canals, and gates directed water where needed, drained flooded areas, and created reservoirs for dry periods. It was continent-scale water management, coordinated by teams of engineers who planned works decades in advance. Egyptians invented the concept of the trademark. Products bore quality seals guaranteeing origin and standards. Commercial papyri show disputes over counterfeits, market regulation, even comparative advertising. It was a sophisticated market economy with quality control, commercial competition, and consumer protection that would make any modern country envious. All this while, the rest of the world was still figuring out basic farming. Egyptians weren't just advanced for their time, they were advanced for any time. If one civilization achieved all this 4,000 years ago using muscle, intellect, and social organization, imagine what we can do today with all our technology, if we show the same dedication, planning, and respect for natural limits that they did. So after spending a full day with the ancient Egyptians, what do you think? They woke up without alarms, worked without air conditioning, had fun without streaming shows, and still built one of the most impressive civilizations in history. The great Egyptian lesson isn't in the pyramids or mummification, though those are incredible. It's in how they organized daily life around natural rhythms our modern society insists on ignoring. They understood something fundamental. You don't fight the desert. You adapt to it. You don't work under the murderous noon sun. You stop and wait for a truce. You don't waste energy battling forces you can't control. That simple wisdom let them build a stable society for 3,000 years. 3,000! Meanwhile, we, with all our technology, struggle to keep a government running smoothly for a decade. Egyptians also balanced work and personal life in a way that would make any productivity coach cry with envy. Work hard in the right hours, stop completely when needed, reserve sacred time for family, friends, and fun. They proved productivity isn't about the sheer number of hours worked, but about working with maximum energy at the ideal moments. 4 focused hours can beat 8 hours spent fighting fatigue. Egyptian religiosity also teaches something important. Spirituality can be a natural part of life without turning into fanaticism. They talked to the gods like they talked to neighbors, respectfully, but without terror or total submission. It was practical faith that gave meaning to daily life without taking it over. They believed in an afterlife, but they lived this life fully first. And perhaps the most valuable lesson, they built a society that worked long-term. As unjust as it was, and it was indeed unjust, it remained stable through droughts, wars, invasions, and climate shifts. This isn't romanticizing Egyptian inequality. It was a brutal society for 90% of the people. But they figured out something we still haven't: how to organize millions to work together toward long-term goals. They built monuments that lasted millennia, developed knowledge we still use, created art that still moves us. All of it with muscle, intellect, and social organization. No electricity, no engines, no computers. If they did all that 4,000 years ago, imagine what we're capable of today. The problem isn't lack of technology. It's lack of planning, patience, and respect for natural limits. Egyptians show that an advanced civilization isn't about fancy gadgets. It's about understanding how the natural world works and working with it, not against it. It's about creating systems that last for generations, not just fiscal quarters. It's about remembering we're humans living on a planet with its own rules. And the sooner we accept those rules, the sooner we can build something truly lasting. So next time you wake up complaining about traffic, remember the Egyptian who woke up grateful for surviving the night in the desert. When you're stressed at work, think of the peasant who stopped at noon because fighting the sun was foolish. And when you think our era is too complicated, remember a civilization that lasted 3,000 years on intelligence, organization, and common sense. The ancient Egyptians left us more than pyramids and mummies. They left a manual for living well under tough conditions, lessons that still hold 4 millennia later. And you? What did you think of this journey through a day in ancient Egypt? Which curiosity surprised you most? Tell me in the comments. I love hearing what you think about past stories that still make sense in the present. If you enjoyed this time travel, subscribe and hit the bell. Every day brings more fascinating stories of civilizations that changed the world. Always with that touch of humor that makes the past more interesting than any series. See you on the next historical adventure.